torpedoes, and rocket-powered missiles, all guided by human pilots.
Look! For some of these young pilots, this was a path of no return.
Japan builds top-secret structures.
This is fantastic.
And terrifying weapons to commit the ultimate sacrifice. This is the incredible story of the kamikaze. The biggest construction projects of World War II, ordered by Hitler and his Japanese allies to secure world domination. Now the ruins survive as dark reminders of their fanatical military ambition. These are the secrets of the Nazi megaweapons. In a secret underground bunker in southern Japan, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki is preparing to unleash suicide squadrons against the American forces.
Assemble the pilots and crews of the Special Attack Unit.
Ugaki's plan? To prevent the invasion of Japan by sending out the greatest number of suicide squadrons ever seen.
Today's mission will not be an easy one. But brave and resolute action will scatter even devils. You will succeed.
His new weapon, a rocket-powered suicide missile. On a hillside in southern Japan, hidden behind a jungle of bamboo, are the remains of the secret command center where Vice Admiral Ugaki masterminded hundreds of suicide attacks.
Well, this is fantastic.
Military historian Mike Pavlik has gained rare access to this forgotten bunker.
Oh, phenomenal. Ugaki buried his headquarters in this mountain to protect it from the Allied bombing. Just look at the thickness of these walls. It's probably 3 feet here at the top and tapering down to about 18 inches here on the sides. It keeps the whole structure very, very solid and secure. This is not just one bunker. This is a series of hundreds of meters of reinforced concrete caves. The Admiral and his staff and secretaries, with maps and telephone and radio, would have been in this underground headquarters, where they directed all of the kamikaze operations against the American fleet.
The story of this terrifying new tactic unfolds in both Japan and Nazi Germany. In Europe, as the tide of the war turned decisively against Hitler, the Nazis planned suicidal missions, driven by fanatical obedience to the Führer and the fatherland. In Japan, the story of suicide squadrons begins in 1940. The Japanese sign a pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. And the three Axis powers promise to assist one another. The Empire of Japan looks to expand its borders, conquering swathes of Asia. The United States' response is to cut off trade with Japan.
The economic blockade puts Japan in a really, really difficult position because clearly it's now on a collision course with the United States.
December 7th, 1941. Japan launches a surprise airstrike against the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
The attack on Pearl Harbor is an enormous success. It massively cripples the Pacific Fleet. It catches the Americans totally unawares.
Japan and her Nazi allies are now at war with the United States. But in the years that follow, the war goes against the Axis powers. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allies invade France to liberate Europe from Nazi rule. And in the Pacific, a vast American fleet sweeps west. Mission: to crush the Empire of Japan. June 19, 1944, the Japanese and Americans meet near the Mariana Islands. Japan faces the full might of the U.S. Navy and suffers a devastating defeat.
Marianas Islands is known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and it's where the US Navy Air Force really gets one over the Imperial Japanese Navy's Air Force.
3 of Japan's aircraft carriers are sunk, some 600 planes destroyed.
The Japanese surface fleet essentially ceases to exist. I mean, the bulk of the fighting Japanese capability is lost at the Marianas.
A core reason for the defeat is the failure of the Japanese fighter plane, the Mitsubishi Zero. Mike is exploring one of only a handful that still survive.
The Zero is simply outclassed by contemporary American aircraft. Part of the problem that the Zero has is that even though it has great range and maneuverability, the fuel system lacks self-sealing fuel tanks. So when American pilots shoot at Zeros, they tend to explode.
Japan needs a new tactic to face down the might of the American fleet. And they need it fast. The Americans are now closing in on Japan. Their next target is the Philippines.
The Philippines, a former US colony, is absolutely crucial for the Japanese because it's through the Philippines that their oil supply comes. And without it, they're absolutely finished.
In October 1944, the man in charge of Japan's Air Force in the Philippines is Takejiro Onishi. His orders are to stop the Allies from invading the islands at any cost. But he only has 30 Zero fighter planes to hold off hundreds of enemy ships.
How can we possibly hold the Philippines with what we have?
His solution is radical and unexpected. Turn the 30 Zero fighter planes into bombs.
I don't think there'll be any other certain way to carry out the operation than to put a 250-kilogram bomb on a Zero and let it crash dive into a U.S. carrier.
This is the first time Japan orders suicide attacks, and it will totally change the face of the war. The new squadron is named Kamikaze, meaning divine wind. The aim, each Zero plane takes out one American ship. To give the Zero the longest range possible, engineers reduce its weight by removing machine guns, armor, and radios. They add extra fuel tanks, and then a 550-pound bomb.
They turn it into a flying missile that would attack the American fleet.
All Vice Admiral Onishi needs now are some pilots.
In Japan, shame is very important. And so it's very hard to say, no, I don't want to die for my country, because that brings shame upon not only yourself, but your family. And so a lot of these young soldiers had to put on a strong face, a strong look. They had to be manly.
Looking for the first ever kamikaze leader, officials call in one of their best pilots, 23-year-old Lieutenant Yukio Seki.
You are being considered to lead the special attack unit. How do you feel about it? You absolutely must let me do it. Thank you.
Seki confides to a journalist that he believes suicide tactics are a waste of his skills. But still, he prepares himself for certain death. And he writes a letter of farewell to his new wife.
My dear Mariko, I am very sorry that I must die before I could do much for you. As I am departing, I recall innumerable memories that we share.
I'm sure they wanted to live, but the situation was so dire, so desperate, that they had no choice but to sacrifice their lives.
The next day, the new kamikazes are ready for their first ever attack.
You're already gods without earthly desires. Your own crash dive is not in vain. I ask you all to do your best.
Let's go.
Before getting into his Zero, Seki makes a last request.
Commander, please give this to my family.
In the seas around the Philippines, the Japanese Navy is fighting an epic battle against the Allies. In the skies above, Yukio Seki leads the first ever squadron of kamikaze pilots. After setting out on 5 successive days, he finally spots an American naval task force.
As the kamikaze pilots approached the American fleet, they would decide their tactics based on which ships they were assigned to attack. If they were assigned to attack aircraft carriers, they would come in really high and take a steep angle of attack in order to try to penetrate the aircraft carrier's decks.
Aircraft carriers are proving to be the most dangerous and effective ships in the American fleet. Each able to deploy up to 100 fighter planes, they are the key to dominating the skies in the Pacific. As Seki looks down, he sees his number one target, an aircraft carrier. Seki's plane smashes into the escort aircraft carrier USS St. Lo. The ship sinks, with 889 men on board.
The attack at Leyte Gulf is incredibly successful because they managed to sink one aircraft carrier, which is the most important weapon, American weapon they could knock out. They badly damaged 3 others, and all for the loss of 5 aircraft. You know, that's a really good hit-to-loss ratio from the Japanese. It looks like this is a tactic that has some legs that may well be paying off.
Buoyed by the success of the kamikaze squadrons, Commander Onishi greatly expands them. New planes and pilots arrive from Japan. Onishi now sends wave after wave of kamikazes to defend the Philippines.
At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 121 kamikaze pilots hit their intended target, sinking 16 American ships. It's the most effective use of air power that the Japanese have had in years.
The power of the kamikazes is not just hitting ships, it's also the psychological effect, that suddenly you are up against an enemy at which there seems to be no limits at all. And that's a terrifying proposition.
But in the midst of the kamikaze's early success, there is a growing problem. The kamikazes are damaging and sinking U.S. ships, but so far they've only sunk 1 aircraft carrier.
The biggest problem is that the Mitsubishi Zero, configured as a suicide weapon, is simply not a big bomb. Even though it's filled with fuel and it's carrying a 550-pound bomb that's supposed to go off, it's not a big enough weapon to sink an American battleship or aircraft carrier.
The Japanese need something new.
And what they come up with is something much more terrifying and much more powerful.
Japan is developing a secret weapon, a rocket-powered missile designed for one purpose: suicide missions. It is named Oka, meaning cherry blossom. Unlike the Zero fighter, the Oka is more bomb than plane.
The Oka was a small, piloted missile that had a huge bomb in the front. It has to be dropped from a larger bomber, and once it's dropped, it glides towards the American fleet, guided by the suicide pilot that's flying it.
Very few original Okas remain. But one, in a restricted hangar in the UK, is in the process of being restored.
Wow. I wasn't expecting to see this. This is something that hasn't been seen in 3/4 of a century.
For aviation technology expert Joe Piccarella, it offers a rare chance to see how the Oka was originally put together.
The whole purpose of the Oka was to carry a warhead to its target. And the whole front end, that's 5.5, 6 feet of the airframe was warhead. 2,600 pounds of high explosives, equivalent to TNT. This was the raison d'etre of the Oka, to carry the largest bomb possible towards the Allied fleet.
The warhead makes up about 60% of the weight of the Oka and fills the entire nose cone. Sitting right behind this massive bomb is a small, basic cockpit for the pilot.
The cockpit contained the bare minimum of instrumentation, just an altimeter, an airspeed indicator, and a compass. And up here is the original arming handle for the warhead. One hard tug of that handle, the warhead was live, there was no going back.
The cockpit also contains something found in no other aircraft.
These two clips would hold the pilot's samurai sword. The pilot would look up, and one of the crew members on the Betty would pass him his last worldly possession, his sword.
Dropped from a height of 20,000 feet, the Oka could glide to a target up to 20 miles away. But there's a problem.
The problem with a gliding bomb is that it's very slow and vulnerable to counter-air fire. So you want to get it going fast enough to evade counter-air fire, but also fast enough so it can penetrate the armor of the ships.
The designers need a way to supercharge their terror weapon. They turn to solid rocket boosters. Three steel tubes inside the rear fuselage contain solid fuel rods. Once ignited, the fuel burns furiously, producing gas. As this gas expands, it is forced at high speed through nozzles at the back to create thrust.
On the top of this control column, the switch is not for guns or a microphone. It's to ignite the 3 rocket motors in the tail that would speed him towards his target.
For one-way suicide missions, the solid rocket booster was perfect. They could propel the Oka more than 150 miles per hour faster than any Allied planes in the Pacific.
The Oka's incredibly fast. In a dive, it can reach speeds in excess of 600 miles an hour, so that's faster than anything else in the sky at that time.
The Oka is a radical solution, but the Japanese are not alone. In Europe, Nazi Germany is desperately searching for ways to improve the accuracy of their own terror weapons. Their answer is also a human navigator. The Nazis add a cockpit to their powerful V-1 cruise missile, creating the Reichenberg. But Hitler is not convinced by the concept of kamikaze-like squadrons. He cancels the manned V-1 program. In Japan, development of the rocket-powered Oka is underway at a top-secret research base in the port city of Yokosuka, south of Tokyo. Today, remains of the base are still hidden amongst factories and warehouses.
These are the very buildings where some of the early Oka were planned, designed, and tested. But the times were so desperate that the Japanese had to start mass production while they were still testing it. It was not ready for prime time, but they needed something new.
One of the buildings that still stands is the Flight Dynamics Test Center.
The prototype of the Oka were brought here to be tested for flight worthiness. Somewhere in this complex, they would have had wind tunnels to test the flight dynamics. They would have had rocket booster test stands to test the rockets themselves. These columns and beams are enormous. These are built very solidly with very thick concrete in small, compact spaces, just in case something exploded.
But the Oka engineers here suffer a major setback. In the fall of 1944, the advancing Americans start bombing Japan's industrial centers. The Japanese need to move the production line of their new weapons to somewhere safer. They choose a hillside right next to their research base in Yokosuka.
Holy cow. Look at the hinges on that.
Overgrown cliffs, hidden from view behind old factories, still house forgotten remains.
This is a huge concrete bunker with these massive inch-thick, bomb-proof, blast-proof doors on the outside, and then another steel door on the inside. 2 sets of protection against bombs, bullets, whatever. It's just very, very heavy construction to protect something that was very vital.
Beyond these bunkers, through dense undergrowth, is evidence of further structures.
This entire mountain is riddled with caverns and tunnels where the Japanese built the Oka. 70 years later, you can still see the striations from the hand tools that were used to hack the stone out to make this cave. In order to protect the secrecy of the program, as well as to keep it safe from American bombs, they moved the entire manufacturing process from the exposed buildings just across the street into caves just like this, not only to build the machine, but also to store the ones that they had already built.
American bombing campaigns slowed the production of the Oka. But the Japanese High Command already have other suicide weapons in the pipeline, including one that attacks not from the skies, but from below the waves. A manned torpedo. Japanese naval engineers developed this revolutionary suicide weapon, known as the Kaiten, from an existing torpedo.
The Kaiten is based on the Type 93 torpedo, which is one of the most successful and most effective torpedoes of the entire war.
Type 93 torpedoes were the most advanced torpedoes at the period. It was very quick. The range was enormous, and most importantly, did not leave a white trail of water behind it.
Like the Type 93 torpedo, the Kaiten has a warhead of over 1.5 tons. Its rear houses a highly explosive oxygen fuel tank and propulsion system that can propel the Kaiten at 30 knots, fast enough to catch most warships in the Pacific. But unlike a torpedo, in the center, right between the warhead and the compressed gas, is a compartment for a pilot, just 3 feet in diameter. The Japanese Imperial Navy is preparing their kamikaze torpedo at Otoshima, a top-secret naval base, hidden on a small island near the south coast. Historian Tosh Minahara is heading for the site.
This is Otoshima, the former Imperial Japanese Navy top-secret base, where they had the human-guided suicide submarines known as Kaiten, which in English it means heaven mover.
Tosh has come to explore what remains of the base. A replica Kaiten stands as a reminder of what the Japanese were doing here in 1944.
So this is the Kaiten. It's a human-guided torpedo with one pilot. The pilot would sit here. You would think, well, why not just a torpedo? Why does it need to have a pilot? Well, the reason why is because of the guidance system. It would supposedly increase accuracy. When you have a person sitting here, he can control it until the last minute.
The 3,400-pound warhead is 30% larger than the one on an Oka missile.
The Kaiten was intended to sink a very large battleship just with one shot. It packed a large punch.
One of the first volunteers to train how to operate the Kaiten is teenager Yutaka Yokota. He arrives at Otoshima in September of 1944. For Yokota to try out his new weapon, it first has to be wheeled out to the water.
This is the path in which they carried the Kaiten, which was built over there, the base over there. They would wheel it on tracks through this tunnel, which they carved out from the hillside. This is really interesting here. You can see actually where the tracks used to be. The Kaiten would be wheeled along here, out to sea. And this is also the path where the pilots would walk through on their training missions, or even, if it's an actual mission. This was a one-way path here. This was a path at no return.
Nearly 48 feet long and weighing over 8 tons, the Kaitans are wheeled the length of the concrete jetty to a launching bay.
Oh, so this is really interesting right here. You have a great vantage point of where they actually launched the Kaitan subs. The tracks would come all the way up here and right there, and then because these subs were fairly heavy, they needed a crane to gently lower it into the ocean.
Once down, a torpedo boat tows the Kaitan to deeper waters.
Typical training mission would entail circling the island all the way around and then coming back. And it was very hazardous. I mean, 15 pilots lost their lives here just on a training mission. And so this was a very, very risky business.
Learning to pilot this cutting-edge weapon takes months. The young trainees like Yokota must learn to navigate blind towards their target. Then take aim by identifying a ship through their periscope.
They weren't guided by anything high-tech. It was just the skill of the pilot. And this pilot could not see. All he had was a compass and a stopwatch.
November 1944. The Japanese are fighting a losing battle against the American fleet in the seas around the Philippines. The Japanese Navy needs the Kaitans fast, but the Allied ships are over 1,600 miles away from the Kaitan base. The Japanese have to find a way to get their suicide torpedoes close enough to attack.
The Kaitan was designed to be strapped onto a larger Japanese mother submarine. About 4 to 6 would be strapped onto the deck, and then these subs with a larger range would take the Kaitan to its intended target.
The first ever Kaitan mission leaves Otsushima Naval Base. Pilot Yokota has not completed his training, but his fellow recruits set out. Their target, an Allied refueling harbor over 1,500 miles away. "12 days later, mother submarines close in on their target. Once released, the Kaitans speed towards a sheltered lagoon where hundreds of American ships are refueling. One Kaitan slams into the side of fuel supply ship USS Mississinewa. This is the actual footage of the ship as 4.5 million gallons of fuel goes up in smoke.
The first success the Kaitans have is one of the most astonishing strikes of the war, really, and it is good news for the Japanese because a Kaitan has actually sunk a ship.
The size of the explosion makes the Japanese think they have sunk 5 American ships. Bolstered by their success, they expand the Kaitan program. But they aren't ready in time to save the Philippines. The Allies begin liberating the islands in December 1944. Next step, the vast Allied fleet makes its move north to the island of Okinawa. They're closing in on mainland Japan. But they are now also coming into direct range of the full force of all Japan's kamikaze weapons, and a man on a mission to rain terror from all sides. A new commander is in charge of the kamikaze squadrons. Naval veteran Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki. Ugaki has fought the Allied fleet at the Philippines and knows just how powerful it is. He now controls kamikaze operations from his high-security underground bunker.
Sir, 5 carriers and 7 escorts have been spotted entering the lagoon.
Assemble the pilot and crews of the special attack unit. The raid is set for tomorrow. All forces to depart by 8:30 a.m.
Ugaki is determined to stop the Allies from taking Okinawa.
The Japanese have an intense fear of being invaded. They haven't been successfully invaded in 2 millennia, and they have no intention of allowing that to happen now.
The Japanese have good reason to fear the Allies. March 10th, U.S. bombers drop over 2,000 tons of firebombs on Tokyo. 16 square miles of the city burns to the ground, killing over 100,000 citizens. It remains the deadliest bombing raid ever. Kamikaze Commander Ugaki's suicide pilots are based in Kanoya on the south coast of Japan. From here, they can strike the Allied fleet as they approach Okinawa. If the Allies take this island, the next step is mainland Japan itself.
It was from this very airfield where Admiral Matomi Ugaki sent his suicide pilots to attack the American fleet.
Mike Pavlik has been granted special access to the airfield by the Japanese Navy.
This is the southernmost airfield in all of Japan. The Americans are only 800 kilometers away at Okinawa. The Japanese are really beginning to feel the American pressure.
Ugaki's planes can now reach the Allied fleet directly. But there's a flip side. The American planes can strike back. The Kamikaze airfield is under constant threat of attack. The Japanese solution can still be seen today, hidden in a disused part of the base.
This is an amazing example of a revetment, a hardened concrete aircraft shelter. You can see it's made out of reinforced concrete, a little bit of the rebar here, very, very thick concrete. And this cutout bit here is called the skirt. It's cut out in the shape of a zero. They could literally back a zero into this space, clearing the tail and the canopy and the notch there and the wings on the sides.
In 1945, more than 260 aircraft shelters like this lined the runways.
These concrete revetments were built to withstand bombs and bullets. It's about 1.5 meters thick at the roof to withstand the impact of a 500-pound bomb. This is about 2 or 3 feet thick to protect against the bullets that are coming in from strafing aircraft. The Zeros that are parked inside here were fairly well protected from just about anything the Americans could throw at them.
Ugaki's plan to save mainland Japan from invasion is swarms of suicide pilots. He sends in squadron after squadron. The battle for Okinawa sees the most intense use of kamikaze tactics ever. And Ugaki has an ace up his sleeve. Japan's secret mega-weapon, the rocket-powered Oka, is finally operational and ready for launch. Saburo Doi is one of the suicide missile pilots, known as the Thunder Gods. He takes his final drink, a ceremonial cup of rice wine.
Today's mission will not be an easy one, but brave and resolute action will scatter even devils. You will succeed.
Doi and 8 other Thunder God pilots head for Okinawa on board bombers carrying the deadly Okas. Nearly 70 miles northwest of the island, Doi's crew spot the first of the U.S. fleet, the destroyer USS Manart L. Abele. Doi prepares for release. At an altitude of 19,000 feet, he drops from his mothership. He fires his rockets. Traveling at up to 600 miles per hour, he bears down on the American destroyer.
It hits the ship square in the middle, it blows up and sinks. It looks like the Japanese have finally got their key killer weapon.
Sir, reports are that we have sunk one enemy ship and damaged at least 14 others. Prepare squadrons for further attacks.
As the U.S. fleet continues its assault on Okinawa, Kamikaze Commander Ugaki sends more and more rocket bombs into the skies. It's an act of desperation, mirrored in Nazi Germany. In April 1945, the Allies are closing in on Berlin. Despite Hitler's previous opposition to suicidal missions, the Luftwaffe is under pressure. It sends squadrons on self-sacrifice missions. First to ram into U.S. bombers, then to crash dive strategic bridges to halt the Allied advance. It's too little too late for Hitler. Berlin falls. But in Japan, the suicide aircraft continue to inflict damage on the Allied fleet off Okinawa. And beneath the waves, the suicide subs are also on the attack. A Japanese submarine approaches the U.S. fleet. Kaiten pilot Yokota prepares to launch his suicide torpedo.
Petty Officer Yokota reporting. Kaiten 3 is manned.
After 8 months of training, Yokota is desperate to play his part in the defense of his motherland.
I repeat, Petty Officer Yokota reporting. Kaiten 3 is manned.
But there's a problem. Water leaking into cables cuts off all Yokota's communication. He can't be released.
Set me loose. I'll find enemy myself.
Yokota is denied the opportunity to sacrifice his life for his nation.
I'll find enemy myself.
The technical faults plaguing his Kaiten aren't the only problems facing underwater squadrons. The mother subs carrying the Kaitens are slow, easy targets for U.S. ships. 8 are blown out of the water before their Kaitens can be released.
Because you have Kaitens that are fairly heavy, 8 tons, that are strapped onto the mother submarine, this creates a lot of drag, and so the submarines are very slow, very difficult to maneuver.
This design flaw is affecting the rocket-powered Oka, too, as rare footage reveals.
The Oka had a potential to be a devastating weapon, but because it had to be delivered by a larger aircraft, a bomber, because those aircraft were so slow and vulnerable, they were often shot down before the Oka even got within range of the U.S. fleet.
So far, the Japanese have sacrificed over 5,000 kamikaze pilots. But these new tactics have failed to halt the advance of the Allies. May 1945. In Europe, Nazi Germany has finally surrendered. More Allied ships are arriving to swell the fleet in the Pacific. And on June 22nd, the Americans secure Okinawa. The Allies are now set to invade the Japanese homeland.
After the fall of Okinawa, Japan is now in pure survival mode.
You'd have thought with the fall of Okinawa that would be it, that the Japanese have got nothing left to chuck at it, but no, they're determined to still keep fighting and throw everything that they've still got at this final desperate defense of the Japanese mainland.
At coastal bases like Otsushima, the Japanese Navy prepare a new way to deploy their torpedo subs.
The Kaiten are now deployed directly from the bases, and so they're tugged out to deeper waters. From there, they're on their own. They are to seek and destroy American ships.
The Japanese also decide to launch their suicide rocket missile, the Oka, directly from hidden coastal locations. One such site is near Miyoshi Village, south of Tokyo.
This concrete pad was the bottom layer of a land-based launch system for the Oka. This would have had steel rails on it. A trolley would sit on top of the rails, which held the Oka. The trolley had rockets on it to get it going down this rail to launch the Oka, to get it enough airspeed to launch it off the end and out towards its targets. It's pointed out towards the sea where the expected American invasion was going to come from.
At the launch point, Mike discovers a clue that reveals the desperation of the Japanese engineers.
Well, this is very interesting. One of the things you can see from this broken piece here is that there was no steel reinforcement. This is very weak concrete that was not built to last very long. Whether they did it because of speed and necessity, or whether they did it because the Japanese were simply out of steel, this is very, very poor construction. This ramp would not have lasted very long with the violence of the launch of these weapons. And as you can see here, it simply broke off at a weak point.
The Japanese start building over 40 of these launch ramps. Behind a local temple, Mike finds more evidence of the launch ramp construction.
This is incredible. These look like the rails for the launch system for the Oka. The channel here is where the trolley would have run that ran down the rails to launch the aircraft. The bolt holes here were where the rails attached to the concrete that we just saw. You can see the tongue and groove here. They fit together and they were machined to be a very coherent system. This is a phenomenal find.
August 1945. Over 600 Oka missiles are on standby. 5,000 aircraft are assigned to kamikaze attacks, and more than 100 Kaidens are primed, all ready for the greatest onslaught of suicide attacks the world has ever seen. But these plans are in vain. On August 6, 1945, the Americans dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, they dropped the second on Nagasaki. While Japan pursued the tactic of one suicide bomber to destroy one ship, the U.S. turned to science to create a bomb that can destroy a whole city.
It is the lethality of this, the destruction caused by these bombs, that finally persuades the Imperial Japanese to throw in the towel at long last and surrender.
The war is over.
Ultimately, you have to see the rather grotesque kamikaze tactics as a complete failure. If you just look at the numbers, they only sunk 51 ships, and out of those, just one aircraft carrier. 51 ships after all that effort, after all those lives lost, is an appalling failure by anyone's standard.
Japanese suicide tactics ultimately failed because the Americans are able to flood the theater with men and material at an unprecedented scale. The Japanese concurrently are running out of everything: food, fuel, men, planes, machines, oil, everything. The Americans simply overwhelmed Japan in the Pacific.
After he hears of Japan's surrender, Kamikaze Commander Ugaki orders one last suicide mission. His own. Overcome by the shame of surrender, he resolves to die in the same way as his young pilots. He records the event for posterity in this photograph. Ugaki can't fly himself, so taking the kamikaze spirit to a new extreme, one of his pilots volunteers to take him as a passenger. But Ugaki's plane is intercepted, and